demanded a full investigation into the BIS's wartime record, which he apparently believed would exonerate him. The prospect of that set off alarms from Whitehall, the British government quarter, to Threadneedle Street, where Lord Cato, the new governor of the Bank of England, had taken over from Montague Norman. McKittrick, noted a Foreign Office memo, had gone native in neutral Switzerland and was thoroughly out of touch with the way people are thinking nowadays. The end of the war did not seem to bring McKittrick any closer to reality. In March 1945, Orvis Schmidt, the US Treasury official who had attended the Bretton Woods Conference, met with McKittrick in Switzerland. Schmidt, like his boss Henry Morgenthau, was not a fan of either McKittrick or the BIS, and McKittrick knew it. It was clear that Mr. McKittrick was fully aware of the manner in which he and the BIS are regarded by the Treasury Department, Schmidt wrote. McKittrick tried his best to persuade Schmidt otherwise. If only the Treasury Department understood the real role that he and the BIS had played, all that would change, the BIS president ardently believed. This seemed unlikely, considering what followed. Schmidt continued, "The BIS, McKittrick said, had been strictly neutral during the war. The bank was a sort of club for the world's central bankers, a little group of like-minded men who understood and trusted one another. This trust was unimpaired by issues such as national, political, or governmental interests. Rather, it was a kind of celestial understanding. It would continue regardless of the condition of the world or of the constantly changing political relations between their respective countries." Unimpressed by McKittrick's eulogy, Schmidt asked McKittrick why the Germans had allowed him to run the BIS in this manner. What was in it for them? In response, McKittrick claimed that in order to understand the conduct of the Germans toward the BIS, one must first understand the strength of the confidence and trust that the central bankers had in each other and the strength of their determination to play the game squarely. McKittrick then said that the German members of this elite could positively influence the German government's conduct. These financiers, said McKittrick, were not Nazis, but were needed by the Nazis because of their technical skills. The existence of this little group is the keystone in the explanation of Germany's conduct with respect to the BIS, he explained. Schmidt asked McKittrick if he could name any members of this group. Only one name was forthcoming. Emil Pohl, the vice president of the Reichsbank, BIS director and guardian of looted gold, for which he would soon be put on trial at Nuremberg. McKittrick admitted that the BIS had accepted payment in gold from the Germans during the war. It had all been kept separately so that it could be checked easily to see if any was looted. McKittrick justified this on the grounds that he thought it would be better to take the gold and hold it in this fashion rather than refuse it and let the Germans use it for other purposes. The conversation then took a surreal turn. Poole, McKittrick continued, knew where the looted Belgian gold was. In the vaults of the Reichsbank, where Poole was holding it, for return to the Belgians after the war. Rather as a fence might justify his possession of stolen goods to police investigating a robbery. McKittrick also admitted that the BIS had supplied the Third Reich with foreign exchange. But by doing so, he suggested, the BIS had actually weakened the Nazi economy, as Germany had paid more into the BIS in foreign exchange than it had received. Schmidt was incredulous. "I was surprised that a voluntary recital intended as a defense of the BIS could be such an indictment of that institution," he wrote to Henry Morgenthau. An American intelligence report on the bank's wartime activities, prepared in December 1945, was even more damning. Much of the report was based on interrogation reports of Emil Pohl, who was singing like the proverbial canary in an effort to save himself from a lengthy prison sentence. Pohl revealed how the Reichsbanks had used the BIS to pull out its money from neutral countries before it was blocked, and then traded the rescued funds with the BIS. He said that German officials had wanted McKittrick to be re-elected as his opinions were safely known, and that the BIS was also of great value to the Reichsbank as an open window to financial information about the outside world. Much of this information, it seems, was provided personally by McKittrick in his conversations with Emil Pohl. Perhaps the most shocking revelation is that McKittrick, after his return from the United States in May 1943, reported to Poole directly on the general picture of the current opinions and financial problems in the United States. McKittrick, the report notes, also provided Poole with advance information about the Allies' tripartite mission to Switzerland in February 1945, when the Allies pushed Swiss officials to freeze Nazi assets and stop trading with Germany. McKittrick was not the only BIS manager providing Poole with intelligence and acting as a go-between for both sides. When Alan Dulles arrived in Bern, one of the first people he met was Per Jacobsen, the BIS's economic advisor. The spymaster and the economist were introduced at a charity party hosted by the wives of the American and British ambassadors. Bern, like Lisbon, Madrid and Stockholm, was crowded with legions of spies, informers and secret agents, trading in information, gossip and intrigue. Dulles and Jacobsen had much to discuss. As a Swedish national and high-ranking BIS official, Jacobsen was of extreme interest to both the Allied and Axis intelligence services. Jacobsen could freely travel to and from Allied and Axis territory. Jacobsen, like his compatriots, the Wallenberg brothers, played both sides. When Jacobsen returned from the United States in the spring of 1942, he discussed American attitudes toward Germany with Emil Poole, the vice president of the Reichsbank. Jacobsen also relayed valuable information about the British General Staff to Poole. In the summer of 1942, Jacobsen asked Paul Hechler, the head of the BIS's banking department, who was also a Nazi Party member, to pass some news on to Poole when Poole next visited Basel. Jacobsen's British brother-in-law, General Sir Archibald Nye, had been appointed Vice Chief of the General Staff. This was valuable intelligence. Both sides carefully watched staff movements among their enemy's military leadership. The arrival or departure of senior officers could herald new strategies or fresh thinking, and herald the rise or decline of a particular commander. Aware that he was breaking a confidence, Jacobsen recorded in his diary that Nye's promotion should be kept from the press. Poole said he was glad to be told. We might make a gentleman's agreement between Hechler himself and me not to mention it further. I pointed out that when it was said in London that what I wrote was too friendly to Germany, these journalists obviously did not know who my relatives were. Thankfully for Jacobsen, these journalists also did not know that he was passing valuable military information to the Reichsbank. Jacobsen, accompanied by Hechler, met Poole in Zurich on May 1, 1943. Poole and the Reichsbank wanted information about the different plans circulating in Washington for post-war currencies and trade. Forward-thinking Nazi officials were already planning ahead for the post-war era. They needed to know what the Allies were thinking. As ever, Jacobsen was ready to help. The meeting must be discreet, Hechler emphasized to Jacobsen. Poole would of course be suspect if people in Germany heard that he had been in Switzerland to discuss these plans, but Poole hoped, of course, that still one day it would be possible to come to an arrangement with the enemy, Jacobsen recorded in his diary. Arrangements with the enemy were why the BIS existed. Poole's wish was granted. The following month, Jacobsen made a speech in Berlin to German commercial bankers entitled The Anglo-American Currency Plans, where he shared his thoughts on Allied post-war economic planning based on what he had learned in the United States. Thanks to the BIS's economic advisor, Allied post-war economic plans were now public knowledge in Nazi Germany. Yet it seems unlikely that Jacobsen gave this speech without the permission of the United States authorities. As the OSS documents on the Harvard Plan reveal, the US government ensured that the channels to Nazi industrialists and businessmen remained open, even as American and British soldiers walked into a hail of machine gun bullets on the beaches of Normandy. Jacobsen's speech, delivered in German, was translated by the American legation in Bern and wired to Washington. Jacobsen also passed information on to his brother-in-law Archibald Nye that was useful to the Allies. In 1940, after visiting Berlin, Jacobsen wrote to Arch, advising Britain and France not to aid Finland in its war with the Soviet Union, as they might soon be on the same side as Russia, fighting the Germans. That letter, said Nye, had been of great value, and he had passed it on to the Foreign Office and intelligence services. Jacobsen, like McKittrick, considered himself above national loyalties, but his heart at least seemed to be with the Allies. He listened to the 9 o'clock news from London every night. When the national anthem was played at the end, he rose and stood at attention. Meanwhile, German anti-Nazi émigrés believed that Georg von Schnitzler, a board member of IG Farben, used the BIS to communicate with the Allies. Von Schnitzler was certainly well placed to send messages to London and Washington. As the sales and commercial chief of the chemical conglomerate, he was one of the Third Reich's most powerful businessmen. Von Schnitzler's boss, Hermann Schmitz, sat on the BIS board. Before von Schnitzler joined IG Farben, he had worked for J.H. Stein, the Cologne bank where Kurt von Schröder was a director, and which ran Special Account S, Himmler's private slush fund. By 1943, like most German industrialists, von Schnitzler understood that the war was lost. Germany would soon fall under international control, hopefully under the Western Allies. The priority was to preserve IG Farben's factories, sites and offices, so that the chemical conglomerate could quickly resume its dominance after the hostilities were ended. Von Schnitzler used the BIS to send a message to the Allies that the bombing of German industry had to stop. According to Heinz Pohl, who was a former associate editor of the Vossische Zeitung, Germany's paper of record until it was dissolved in 1934. Pohl had excellent sources among German émigrés and in neutral countries. He wrote, "According to information emanating from Lisbon, Schnitzler is said to have drawn up a memorandum, which he has sent to the board of directors of the Bank for International Settlements at Basel, Switzerland. It is not known whether the memorandum arrived in Basel in time for the general meeting, which took place at the beginning of June, the American Mr. McKittrick presiding as usual, but several points raised in the memorandum are known. Schnitzler, the Lisbon sources say, stresses the fact that the term unconditional surrender implies that the Germans will still have something to surrender. But if the war of destruction, especially the bombing of the industrial centers in Germany, goes on, then there will be nothing left in the end but ruins and ashes." Schnitzler's terms were clear, wrote Pohl. Collaboration on condition that German industry survives. If the bombs stopped falling, the German industrialists would cooperate with the forthcoming occupation. As none of the IG Farben main sites had been much damaged by bombing so far, von Schnitzler's offer might not sound too unreasonable to other industrialists on the side of the United Nations. The BIS was used by Japan as a channel to try and negotiate a peace treaty. Japan was a founding member of the bank and kept its links with Basel during the war. In July 1945, two Japanese bankers, Kojiro Kitamura, a board member of the BIS, and Kan Yoshimura, the head of the BIS's exchange section, asked Per Jacobson if he would act as an intermediary to arrange a peace accord. The Allies demanded unconditional surrender, but the crucial point for Tokyo, the bankers said, was that Japan would retain the royal family and, ideally, the country's constitution. Jacobson, naturally, passed the information to his close friend, Alan Dulles, who took the Japanese proposal to Henry Stimson, the Secretary for War. They discussed it in Potsdam on July 20, 1945, but events soon overtook the slow pace of the backdoor diplomacy. On August 6, Hiroshima was destroyed by an atomic bomb, followed by a second one in Nagasaki on August 9. 6 days later, Japan surrendered. Jacobson at least had the excuse that he was a citizen of neutral Sweden to justify his contacts with the Nazi bankers. McKittrick, whose homeland was at war with the Third Reich, did not. Cocooned in Basel, the BIS president seemed to have lost touch with reality, let alone morality. McKittrick had spent the war years in a parallel universe, one in which neutrality meant that the Reichsbank, the financial motor of war, plunder and genocide, was judged equal to those banks whose assets it had stolen. A place where Pohl, the Reichsbank's vice president and receiver of stolen goods, was actually helping the victims by keeping their goods in a safe place, and where Pohl, and doubtless Hjalmar Schacht as well, were not the builders and managers of the Nazi economy. Instead, they were merely technocratic bankers who only wanted to play the game squarely. It is hard to judge which is worse, that McKittrick really believed these arguments, or they were a cynical lawyer's ploy to ward off difficult consequences. McKittrick was certainly nervous about possible consequences of his entanglements with Nazi bankers, especially with Paul Hechler, the head of the banking department, who continued to sign his correspondence Heil Hitler throughout the war. Fate came to McKittrick's rescue when Hechler died in 1945. His death raises a serious administration problem while solving a political one, wrote McKittrick to Roger Aubois. But with Allen Dulles covering his back, McKittrick had nothing to worry about. McKittrick travelled to Germany at least twice in 1945, and in September stayed at Allen Dulles's house in Dahlem, in Berlin. Although McKittrick was still president of the BIS, his laissez-passer was organised by the OSS, and numerous senior American officials received him. Not everybody shared Dulles's enthusiasm for the BIS's president. There was a nasty surprise waiting for McKittrick on his return to Basel. The October 11 edition of the New York Herald Tribune carried a scathing attack on the BIS, and the article was reprinted in the Tribune de Lausanne, a Swiss newspaper. The article reported that the American occupation authorities in Germany were investigating whether the BIS had supported Germany's gold operations and helped finance Nazi rule in other countries. McKittrick's activities during the war were criticized. The bank may be called to give evidence on its gold transactions with Germany during World War II, it added. Hypersensitive as ever to press criticism, and doubtless mindful of his need to find a new job in the United States, McKittrick asked Allen Dulles to take action. The source of the leaks, he suspected, was an American official named Fox, whom McKittrick had met in Frankfurt. Fox was a colleague of Harry White. White and his associates have taken consistently an extremely unfriendly attitude toward the BIS, and the attacks on the bank at the Bretton Woods Conference originated with White, complained McKittrick. Despite the bad publicity and attacks on McKittrick's, the bankers at Basel got on with what they knew best, keeping the money moving. Quietly, carefully, barely noticed by the outside world, the BIS returned to business as usual. In December 1946, the bank held its first post-war directors' meeting. Maurice Frère, the governor of the National Bank of Belgium and BIS board member, travelled to Washington, D.C. to lobby U.S. policymakers to free the BIS's blocked assets and to try to defuse the media attacks. He found a sympathetic hearing. The turning point came in May 1948, when the BIS agreed to return 3.74 metric tons of looted gold to Belgium and the Netherlands. In exchange, the Allied Tripartite Commission, which dealt with Nazi plunder, agreed to drop all future claims against the bank. The US Treasury freed all BIS assets. Frère was elected president of the BIS, the bank's first since Thomas McKittrick's term had come to an end in June 1946. The Bretton Woods resolution calling for the BIS to be liquidated quietly faded away. Meanwhile, Thomas McKittrick had a lucrative new job. Soon after he stepped down as BIS president in 1946, he was appointed a vice president at Chase National in New York, in charge of foreign loans. McKittrick was even lauded by those whose stolen goods he had purveyed. He was invited to Brussels and decorated with the Royal Order of the Crown of Belgium. The honour, noted a press release, was in recognition of his friendly attitude to Belgium and his services as president of the Bank for International Settlements during World War II. Part 2. Bundesreich. Chapter 9. United States to Europe. Unite or else. Our whole concept of the unification of Europe was that it would first contribute to economic unification. Then we hoped to secure an economic military unity, and finally, a political unity. Averell Harriman, U.S. Special Envoy for the Marshall Plan for the post-war reconstruction of Europe. Thomas McKittrick opened his hotel door to find 15 slips of paper on the floor. It was the spring of 1947, and McKittrick, Vice President at Chase National Bank, was passing through London. The messages from the switchboard indicated that someone in Washington, D.C. was urgently trying to get in touch. McKittrick asked the operator to phone the number, and the call went through soon afterward. A voice said, "Is that you, Tom? This is Averell Harriman. You're coming to work for me for 6 months. I talked to Winthrop this morning, and he said you could." Winthrop was Winthrop Aldrich, the chairman of the board of Chase National Bank. Aldrich, who had run the bank since 1934, was one of the best connected financiers in the United States. His father, Nelson Aldrich, had given his name to the plan, which had eventually resulted in the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Winthrop Aldrich was now an outspoken advocate of economic aid to Western Europe. Aldrich and McKittrick were old friends. In December 1945, at the height of the political attacks against McKittrick and the BIS over their acceptance of Nazi gold, McKittrick had written to Aldrich, complaining about the people in Washington who seem to dislike us so heartily. McKittrick explained, "The situation will need to be handled skillfully." And indeed it was, at least from the point of view of the BIS, which survived, and its former president, who was now working for Aldrich. Harriman, the man at the other end of the line, was also a prominent banker and a diplomat who had served as US ambassador to London and Moscow. Harriman was now one of the most powerful men in the world, in charge of the Marshall Plan, the $12 billion American aid program to reconstruct post-war Europe. Harriman asked McKittrick if he could be in Paris to start work on June 2. "Yes, gladly," replied McKittrick. 2 millennia ago, the Roman philosopher Cicero observed, "The sinews of war are infinite money." An updated version of his epithet would note that the sinews of war are the transnational flow of infinite money, which will find its way around any obstacle. When the Allied leaders met at Potsdam in August 1945, they agreed that the German economy would be decentralized and the power of the cartels broken up. But the Nazi industrialists had no fear of such threats. Thomas McKittrick, as the OSS Harvard Plan documents show, had already reassured them that even if decartelization took place, the Allies would still guarantee their profits. By the time Harriman summoned McKittrick to Paris, it had long been decided in Washington that the German business elites would not be punished. The Morgenthau Plan, which called for Germany to be stripped of its industrial might and turned into a pastoral state, had been so watered down by General Lucius Clay, the American commander of occupation forces, that it was meaningless. Clay had set up shop in Frankfurt at the former headquarters of IG Farben, whose buildings had mysteriously escaped Allied bombing. Washington's JSC Directive 1779, passed in the summer of 1947, institutionalized this change in policy. German industry would be rebuilt. Its steel mills and forges would once again be the powerhouse of Europe. What would be the role of the BIS in the German Renaissance? After 1945, the bank had no reason to exist. The BIS had been founded to manage German reparations payments, and none had been paid since the early 1930s. The BIS claimed it was needed as a meeting place where central bankers could gather to coordinate monetary policy. But as commercial airlines expanded their networks across the world, the BIS's lush hospitality could easily be replicated in a hotel or conference room in London, Paris, Wall Street, or anywhere else the bankers wished to gather. The BIS said it was needed to help coordinate the post-war global economy. The new institutions of the IMF and the World Bank had been founded for precisely this reason. Unlike the BIS, the IMF and World Bank were not Nazi collaborators. The Basel bankers had also lost their golden touch. For the first time, in 1946, the BIS registered a loss. The founders could not help. Montague Norman, now in his mid-70s, had retired from the Bank of England. Raised to the peerage as Baron Norman of St. Clair, his legacy endured, and he remained influential. But he could no longer move markets with a sentence or two. Nor could Hjalmar Schacht provide assistance to the bank he had once proudly called his own. Schacht had been arrested after the July 1944 plot against Hitler and sent to Dachau concentration camp. He survived and was liberated by the US Army. He was then arrested and put on trial at Nuremberg and charged with organizing Germany for war, which is precisely what he had done. Unbowed by the weight of the proceedings, Schacht and his lawyers were putting up a spirited defense, aided by his sporadic instances of public opposition to the Nazis during the 1930s. Yet, ultimately, no matter how tainted its reputation, Norman and Schacht's creation would prove as durable as they had hoped. Throughout the war, the repeated arguments of BIS officials that the bank must keep working so that it could play a central role in the reconstruction of post-war Europe had found a ready audience among both the Allied and Axis leadership. Bureaucratic inertia also helped the BIS. The general sentiment in both Washington, D.C. and London was that the bank could be useful and was too complicated to dismantle. The BIS was built to last, argued British Treasury officials. It was both a Swiss corporation and an international organisation protected by its own treaty. Britain had just won a war, and there were other priorities for scarce resources. Lord Cato, the new governor of the Bank of England, also came to the BIS's defence. The IMF was completely new, and who knew how effective it would be? The BIS, in contrast, had existed for 15 years and was staffed by experts. Post-war Europe, like pre-war Europe, still needed a place for pan-European meetings of central bankers. Basel remained the ideal venue. But before a cent of Marshall aid could be sent to Europe, the plan had to be approved by the US Congress. Harriman set up a bipartisan committee of political, labor, and business leaders to steer the plan through the US government and persuade American public opinion that it was in their best interest to send tax dollars to the war-ravaged continent. The committee's members included Owen Young, the architect of the last German reparations program, whose own eponymous plan had set up the BIS, and, of course, Alan Dulles, who saw the Marshall Plan as a means of dealing the death blow to the spread of communism in Western Europe. Barely a few months after the war ended, Alan Dulles was already demanding imports of food and raw material to rebuild German industry. He condemned the arrest and detention of 100,000 Nazis. "We find ourselves in the concentration camp business on a large scale," he told the Foreign Policy Association in January 1946, as though the German detainees who were fed, clothed, and received medical treatment from the Allies were about to be dispatched to the gas chambers. In July 1947, soon after General Marshall announced his plan, the Conference for European Economic Cooperation, CEEC, met in Paris to work out how it would be implemented. The State Department made it clear to its European allies that American aid would come at a price: financial and economic cooperation between the recipient countries, with a view toward eventual European Union. The first step was to replace bilateral trade deals and exchange controls with multilateral policies. The following year, the CEEC was institutionalized as the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, OEEC, which still exists today as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. The OEEC's mandate was, essentially, to ensure that the State Department's plan for Europe, and especially Germany, was implemented. It was charged with promoting economic and political cooperation between its members, developing intra-European trade by removing barriers and tariffs, and studying the feasibility of customs unions, free trade, and multilateral payments. The Marshall Plan was administered by another new agency, the European Cooperation Administration, ECA, which is where Thomas McKittrick worked. McKittrick arrived in Paris for the first ECA meeting on June 2, 1947. Conditions did not meet the standards of the BIS, he recalled. "The American embassy let us have a room and a secretary, but the room didn't have any carpet on the floor and only the barest of bare furniture, and we sat there. There were 12 people present, and Harriman instructed each as to his responsibilities. McKittrick's was trade and payments. The dozen officials had no office, no organization, and no support staff. But they did have $5 billion in the bank, which they had to distribute quickly, and McKittrick no longer had to worry about Henry Morgenthau and Harry Dexter White. Morgenthau had stepped down as Treasury Secretary in 1945 and was now largely retired from public life. He devoted himself to Jewish causes and helping the new state of Israel. White left government and joined the IMF as its first US executive director. He was an idealist as well as a realist. He saw the IMF as a means to promote economic growth through trade and financial stability. White, like the BIS, believed in global financial cooperation as the path to prosperity, but crucially, a cooperation coordinated among governments rather than unelected central bankers and technocrats. After 1945, White was subjected to sustained attacks on his patriotism, attacks that James M. Boughton, the IMF's official historian, has described as ranging from the questionable to the bizarre. White's failed attempt to bring the Soviet Union into the IMF in 1944, when the country was an ally of the United States, and his meeting with Soviet officials were recast as support for communism. So was his support for the Morgenthau Plan to deindustrialize Germany. White's request to the nationalist government in China to account for how it had spent hundreds of millions of dollars in American aid was respun as sympathy for Mao Zedong's communist forces. In August 1948, White was called to testify before the House of Representatives Committee on Un-American Activities to be questioned about his relations with the Soviets. Historians continue to investigate these. There is evidence that White passed sensitive information to Moscow. Decrypted Soviet diplomatic cables from the 1940s detail White's discussions of American foreign policy with a Soviet official. But an authoritative biography of White by Bruce Craig argues that White was regarded by Moscow as a trusted individual rather than an active agent. Certainly, White's influence on policy-making and access to high-level governmental decision-making made him a person of great interest to the Soviets. Whether White was an agent or an asset, he was passing sensitive information to a hostile foreign power. Craig argues that White was a Rooseveltian internationalist who believed in the need for cooperation with the Soviets rather than a communist. Either way, such views were no longer acceptable in Washington in the late 1940s. White suffered from heart trouble. His appearance before the committee was highly stressful. 3 days later, he died. Meanwhile, the BIS was swiftly building itself into the new global financial architecture. That September 1947, bank officials in charge of protocol and hospitality were in overdrive. The BIS was preparing for the two most important VIPs it had received since the end of the war: John McCloy, the president of the new World Bank, and Eugene Black, its executive director. There was little danger of discord. McCloy was one of the most influential advocates of normalization with Germany. Black was a former vice president of Chase National, the new employers of Thomas McKittrick. McCloy had deliberately sabotaged the Morgenthau Plan and steered President Roosevelt away from punishing Germany in favor of rebuilding German industry. As the website of the United States Embassy in Germany notes, he was instrumental in undermining the proposed Morgenthau Plan for Germany, which would have reduced the country to a land of forests and farms. The Marshall Plan was certainly a triumph for the pre-war Wall Street Berlin financiers. McCloy, Black, and Harriman all had extensive pre-war financial interests in Nazi Germany, as McKittrick had. McCloy had been a partner in Cravath, a powerful New York law firm, which represented General Anna Lynn Firm, I.G. Farben's American subsidiary. Like his friend Alan Dulles, McCloy had been based in Paris in the pre-war years, where he ran the law firm's office. McCloy left Cravath in 1940 to serve as Assistant Secretary for War. This prevented a potentially ugly conflict of interest. The Cravath's clients also included the United States Alkali Export Association, Alcaso, which had intentionally deprived the United States of vital chemicals during the war. Alcaso was composed of the 11 most important alkali producers in the United States and handled their foreign trade. In 1936, Alcaso entered into a cartel agreement with Solvay N.C., the Belgian chemicals company represented by John Foster Dulles, and Imperial Chemical Industries, a British combine. The cartel continued during the war, and in 1942 the Department of Justice launched an investigation into Alcaso, just as it had with Standard Oil. Standard Oil had restricted the United States' ability to produce artificial rubber. Alcaso prevented free trade in soda ash, a basic ingredient in vital war materials such as glass, textiles, and numerous chemicals. In 1944, the Justice Department launched a civil lawsuit against Alcaso and ICI for breaching the Sherman Antitrust Act. Also named as co-conspirators were Solvay N.C. and I.G. Farben. Alcaso was charged with restricting exports and prohibiting imports, eliminating competition, and price fixing. Cravath and Alcaso lost the case. The 60-page decision, delivered by federal judge Samuel Kaufman, was blistering. It found that Alcaso had near total control of alkali imports and exports. Alcaso even ran its own network of inspectors at docks to examine materials leaving the United States. It compiled a blacklist of all competitive exporters and instructed its members not to sell to those on it. It forced its customers to give written assurances that they would not sell their products outside the United States. The cartel had continued during the war years, the decision, delivered in 1949, noted. McCloy was a ruthless, self-made man who was not known for his humanitarianism. On the contrary, the president of the World Bank had been instrumental in the internment of some 120,000 American citizens and residents of Japanese ancestry, causing an enormous amount of human suffering, a bitter legacy that still lingers today. Arguably, he had blood on his hands. McCloy used his office and influence over Henry Stimson, the Secretary for War, to repeatedly block attempts by Jewish organizations to have the US Air Force bomb Auschwitz. By 1944, numerous testimonies of escapees and witnesses had reached Western capitals. It was widely known among both governments and Jewish organizations that the camp was an industrial death factory. Allied bombers regularly overflew the complex, and occasionally bombed the outlying IG Farben Buna factory at Auschwitz III and other buildings. It would have been comparatively simple to destroy the key railway junctions and gas chambers. In August 1944, soon after 430,000 Hungarian Jews had been deported to Auschwitz, where most were gassed on arrival, A. Leon Kubowitzki of the World Jewish Congress wrote to McCloy asking that Auschwitz be bombed. McCloy refused. He replied that such an operation would demand diversion of resources being used elsewhere and would be of doubtful efficacy, an argument also echoed by British officials. McCloy also made the macabre claim that bombing Auschwitz might provoke even more vindictive action by the Germans, although it is hard to imagine what could be more vindictive than the industrialized extermination of thousands of people per day. Eugene Black, McCloy's colleague at the World Bank, had joined Chase National in 1933 as vice president. He was promoted to senior vice president in charge of the bank's investment portfolio. This was substantial. At that time, Chase National was the world's largest bank in terms of assets, which is why it was so appreciated by Nazi Germany. Averell Harriman's financial links with Germany also stretched back decades. Soon after the end of the First World War, he had set up his own bank, W.A. Harriman, which carried out extensive business in Germany. Together with Lee Higginson, the former employers of McKittrick, W.A. Harriman Bank lent to the Berlin City Electric Company by John Foster Dulles, a board member of the International Chamber of